You know how it is, you really want to get your head around something complicated, but just wading through all the theory can feel overwhelming.
Definitely.
Well, that's what we do here on the deep dive. We try to give you that shortcut to the really interesting stuff.
Hmm.
Today, we're plunging into a work that's, well, it's hugely influential, but let's be honest, it can leave you scratching your head a bit. Jean Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death.
Absolutely. And it came out back in 1976, but it offers this really unique way of looking at our culture today. Well,
Right.
Baudrillard, he's building on thinkers like Marx and the structuralists who studied language, and also the media guy, Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah.
And he basically argues that our whole idea of value has just gone through this massive change.
Exactly. So maybe put aside your usual ideas about economics just for a moment. Our mission here in this deep dive is to really get to the heart of Baudrillard's argument,
Okay.
which is that we've moved past a society focused on, making and trading actual physical stuff.
Right. The old production model.
Yeah. Instead, we're now living in a world run by simulation. It's all about the constant flow of signs and symbols.
That's the core idea.
Okay, so let's kick things off with this structural revolution of value that Baudrillard talks about. He starts with ideas about language, doesn't he?
That's right. He looks back at Ferdinand de Saussure, the linguist. Saussure pointed out that a word's value kind of have two sides.
Okay.
First, it's like currency, you can exchange it for something else. Like if I say apple, that word points to, a real piece of fruit.
The physical thing. Got it.
But second, a word's value also comes from how it relates to other words in the language. Apple means something partly because it's not orange or banana.
Right, it's defined by what it isn't, too.
Exactly. And Saussure increasingly emphasized that second part, the relational aspect.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's where it gets, really interesting with Baudrillard.
Mhm.
He argues we've had this structural revolution where that relational side of value, it just completely takes over. And the link between the sign, like that word apple, and the actual thing it represents, the real apple, has been, and this is his word, annihilated.
Yeah. Annihilated. It's a strong word.
That's a huge claim.
It is. Baudrillard's point is that the whole system of symbols we use, it becomes self-contained, like a hall of mirrors almost. Detached from any solid real-world grounding.
Oh.
All the ways we used to understand things. Production, meaning even our feelings, history. They lose their connection to something tangible.
He uses money as an example again here, right? Like how it started out tied to something real, like gold.
Exactly. Tied to the gold standard.
But now it can be used for all this financial speculation, these complex derivatives, things that have no direct physical backing at all.
Precisely. And he calls this the flotation of money in signs.
Hmm.
It's a key idea for him.
Okay.
He sees this disconnection happening not just with money, but also with what we think we need, our desires, and the goals of making things, even the idea of work itself.
So everything just floats free.
Kind of. Everything becomes interchangeable, swappable. It leads to this sort of endless inflation of symbols, detached from reality.
He has that really striking quote, doesn't he? Signs are exchanged against each other rather than against the real.
Yeah, and the second part is crucial. It's
Mhm.
not that they just happen to be exchanged against each other. They do so on condition that they are no longer exchanged against the real.
Wow, so the exchange depends on cutting the link to reality.
Exactly. That condition is key. It actively requires the break from the real.
That really hammers home the idea.
Absolutely. And this leads to what Baudrillard calls the death of determinacy,
Meaning.
meaning the stable, predictable links are gone. The connection between our symbols and what they mean, between our work and what it actually produces,
Yeah.
it all just dissolves. He even calls it the extermination of the real of production and the real of signification.
Extermination. Okay, so this huge shift in value, it's clearly not just about economics then.
Not at all.
Baudrillard goes beyond standard political economy. He even says the term political economy of the sign is just like a temporary label. Why is that?
Because the change he's describing is much more fundamental, much deeper. This structural law of value, it doesn't just tweak how we trade goods.
It changes meaning itself.
It completely changes how we create and understand meaning, how we make sense of the world. The focus shifts from the sign, that thing pointing to something else, to the code.
The code, what's the code?
Think of it like the underlying rules of the whole system,
Yeah.
the operating system behind the signs.
Okay. He says the old idea of value, based on equivalence, this thing equals that thing, worked across both language and making stuff.
Right, there was a kind of parallel logic.
But this new structural law.
It points towards indeterminacy. Everything becomes uncertain in relation to everything else. The clear lines we used to draw between making physical things and the world of symbols and signs, they start to blur.
And then disappear.
Eventually, yeah. We move towards this more general assemblage, he calls it,
Right.
where naming something and making something aren't really distinct activities anymore. They kind of blend together.
And the big conclusion from Baudrillard is, with this code taking over everything production, the economy, representation, the signs themselves, it all just collapses into simulation.
That's the core claim. Simulation takes over.
That sounds pretty radical.
It is very radical. He talks about the end of labor, the end of production, the end of political economy as we traditionally understood it.
Wow.
Even the end of the basic building block of the signified relationship, the symbol and what it stands for. And the end of the classic economic distinction between exchange value and use value.
The difference between what something costs and what it's actually for.
Right. All these foundational concepts, he argues, are dissolving into this new logic of the code and simulation.
Okay, but here's a really crucial point I picked up on. He's not saying this is, like, the communist revolution Marx predicted, right?
No, definitely not.
He actually argues that capital itself is what gets rid of this old social order based on production.
That's a critical distinction, absolutely. For Baudrillard, it's the internal logic of capitalism that drives this shift. It's not some external force overthrowing the system.
It's the system eating its own tail, almost.
Or perhaps more accurately, transforming itself from within into something else. Something based on codes and simulation, not production.
Okay. So this era of simulation, how does Baudrillard see it actually showing up in the world around us? He talks about how things that used to be opposites or in conflict can now just be swapped around or treated as the same.
Exactly. Think about fashion, for example.
Okay.
What's considered beautiful or ugly can change incredibly fast, right? Sometimes it even seem to blend or become interchangeable.
Yeah, totally.
Or look at politics. The traditional distinctions between left and right, they often seem much blurrier now, don't they?
Definitely feels that way sometimes.
Or think about the news media. Trying to figure out what's true versus false can be incredibly difficult.
Tell me about it.
Or even just everyday objects. Something purely useful versus something completely useless both can become desirable consumer items. And even our basic grasp of nature versus culture, that gets fuzzy too.
So all the big ways we used to judge things, the humanist criteria, he calls them good, bad, beautiful, hoogly, useful, useless, they all get kind of blurred, indistinct.
Exactly. Baudrillard sees this world of images and symbols where everything becomes undecidable, and that's a direct result of the code dominating. The code works by neutralizing things, making them indifferent.
He uses a pretty strong image here, calling it the generalized brothel of capital.
He does. And he's quick to clarify, he's not talking about literal prostitution.
Right.
He means it metaphorically, about the endless substitution and commutation of signs.
Right.
Everything can be swapped for anything else in this system.
And he emphasizes that this isn't just happening in the superstructure like culture, art, ideas.
Right, the stuff Marxists might put on top.
It's now actually affecting the basic infrastructure, the economy itself.
Yes, that's key. The same logic of uncertainty, of interchangeability that rules the world of signs now infiltrates the economic sphere itself.
And if the economic base gets shaky,
then the whole idea of the economy being the fundamental driver of society starts to crumble too.
Okay. Let's move on to this idea of the end of production. Baudrillard draws a contrast between how we used to think about value and how economics changed that. How did people see value before it got tied to labor?
Well, often value was seen as something given, maybe from divine grace or just from nature itself.
Not something humans made.
Right. It wasn't seen as something created through human effort or work in the same way. Even early economic thinkers back in the 1700s saw the cycles of land and agriculture as just happening, not having inherent value created by people.
So the idea of a law of value was more about how things were naturally distributed.
Yeah, more like a natural order, not based on some rational, human-driven system of production and equivalence.
Then comes the big shift with the rise of political economy, where value gets explicitly linked to human labor.
Precisely. Now, value is seen as originating from the specific, logical, measurable act of people working together.
You can quantify it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with that comes the concept of surplus value. You know, the extra value workers create that goes to the owners.
The basis for the critique of capitalism.
Right. And this whole way of thinking uses social production, the act of making things collectively, as its main reference point.
But Baudrillard's argument is that we've gone past that stage, too. He says things like production, the commodity form, labor power, equivalence, and surplus value are now things of the past. That's a really bold statement.
It is hugely bold. He's suggesting we've transitioned from this commodity law of value, tied to making things, to a structural law of value.
One based on the code.
Yes. And this shift happens alongside what he calls the obliteration of the social form known as production.
Obliteration, again with the strong words.
It leads him to question, are we even still in a capitalist mode of production? Or is it something else? Maybe hyper-capitalist, he muses, or maybe a very different order altogether.
And this structural law of value, what makes it so different, so dominant?
Baudrillard sees it as the purest, most illegible form of social domination.
Illegible, meaning hard to see.
Hard to see, hard to grasp. Unlike older forms of power based on, say, a ruling class or direct force, this operates subtly. It works through the codes and signs that saturate everything, almost invisibly controlling things.
Wow. And he even suggests that this structural revolution of value eliminated the basis of the revolution itself with a capital R. Why does he think that?
Because those traditional ideas of revolution, especially Marxist ones, they relied heavily on the idea of the working class, of labor, as this unique historical force capable of overthrowing the system.
Agent of change.
Exactly.
Oh.
But in Baudrillard's view, with this loss of reference, where reality becomes unstable and work itself gets transformed into just one sign amongst many.
This other symbol.
Yeah, just another interchangeable sign, commutable with leisure or consumption or anything else. Well, then those revolutionary frameworks lose their grounding. Labor loses its special, historically significant position.
He has that really dense but powerful quote about it. Sign form seizes labor.
And rids it of every historical or libidinal significance, and absorbs it in the process of its own reproduction.
So it strips work of its meaning and just uses it to copy itself.
The operation of the sign behind the empty allusion to what it designates is to replicate itself. Yeah, that's the idea. Work becomes a kind of empty signifier, endlessly reproduced by the system, detached from any real meaning or purpose beyond perpetuating the code.
So the link between work and actually making stuff, building wealth, that connection is just cut.
Severed. That's his argument. And now, when countries track their economies, they're just tracking numbers, statistics, growth figures that don't necessarily point to any real substance or collective goal anymore. They just point back to the system itself.
So the passion for growth is dead because nobody really believes in the passion for production.
Kind of, yeah. But he says it's still more necessary than ever to reproduce labor as a social ritual. What does that mean?
What does he mean by that? Why reproduce it if it's lost its meaning?
Well, in this new context, work becomes a tool for social cohesion, maybe. A habit, a moral imperative, a way to maintain consensus and control within the logic of the code.
So it's about social control, not production.
It seems that way.
Whatever.
We're asked to conform, to integrate into the system, not necessarily to produce value in the old sense. Value is now just defined by your position within the code, within the overall scenario of production.
It sounds like we've entered this really weird, almost uncanny secondary existence that's totally cut off from the familiar world of traditional work and production.
It's an unsettling picture, for sure.
Okay, now Baudrillard introduces this framework, this idea of 3 orders of simulacra. What are these orders, and how do they map onto this changing idea of value we've been tracing?
Right, the 3 orders. Think of them as 3 historical stages in how simulation, or the copy, relates to the real, and how that connects to the dominant law of value at the time.
Okay, stage 1.
The first order is the counterfeit. This was dominant from, say, the Renaissance up to the Industrial Revolution. It's linked to what he calls a natural law of value. Think unique artworks, craftsmanship, things where the distinction between the original and the fake, the counterfeit, is really important.
Okay.
Stage 2. Second order is production. This corresponds to the Industrial Revolution and is governed by the market law value. This is the era of mass production.
Right.
And the third order, where he argues we are now, is simulation, which is governed by the structural law of value, the logic of the code.
Got it. Let's dig into that second order, the industrial simulacrum, a bit more. What are its key features?
So this is the era, obviously, of the factory of mass production. We start seeing mass-produced signs and objects. And crucially, unlike counterfeits, these things aren't really trying to be unique originals. Their nature is to be produced en masse.
They're designed to be identical copies.
Exactly. So the relationship shifts. It's no longer about an original versus a fake copy. It's about equivalence and indifference among items in a potentially infinite series.
And this mass production is only possible because...
Because, Baudrillard argues, the concept of the original reference has been extinguished. You need to kill the idea of the unique original to enable the general law of equivalences that makes mass production possible.
He brings in Walter Benjamin here, right? His famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction.
Yes, absolutely. Benjamin had this incredible insight into how mechanical reproduction doesn't just copy the original, it fundamentally changes the nature of the original, its purpose, even the status of the creator.
It changes everything.
Baudrillard takes that idea and expands it, arguing that all material production eventually falls under this logic of reproduction. He claims the real engine of contemporary capitalism isn't traditional industrial production anymore.
But what is it then?
It's reproduction, in a broader sense. Fashion, the media, advertising, information, and communications networks. This whole sphere is the realm of simulacra and the code.
So thinkers like Benjamin and McLuhan, too, they saw technology not just as a tool for making more stuff.
Right. They saw it as a medium in itself, something that actively shapes and creates new kinds of meaning, new realities. The real, game changer, as Baudrillard sees it, echoing them, was reproduction itself.
The ability to copy endlessly.
Yes. And in this second stage, production starts to lose its inherent meaning because its social purpose gets absorbed into this endless cycle of reproduction, of making copies. The image, the copy, starts to take precedence over the real.
Okay, and this leads us directly into the third order simulacra, the age of simulation we're supposedly living in now. What's the key difference here, moving from production to simulation?
The big shift, he says, is from mechanical reproduction, making identical copies, to generation through models.
Generation through models, what does that mean?
It means things are now generated based on abstract models, codes, or concepts, rather than being copied from a physical original. Think about digital modeling, algorithms generating content, DNA sequencing.
Ah, okay. So meaning comes from how something aligns with the model.
Exactly. Meaning derives from its affiliation to the model, not from any connection to an external reality or purpose. This is simulation in the modern sense Baudrillard is getting at.
Where the structure, the code, is more fundamental than just churning out copies.
Right. He talks about modulation being more fundamental than serial reproducibility. The structural, not the market, law of value prevails. And he argues quite radically that even the possibility of industrial production, the second order, has to be understood by looking back at the genesis of these codes and third-order simulacra.
So the later stage actually explains the earlier one.
In a way, yes. Each order sort of envelops and reinterprets the previous one. The logic of the code ultimately underpins even mass production.
Okay, now Baudrillard takes this even deeper into what he calls the metaphysics of the code. He even connects it back to the philosopher Leibniz and his binary system. That seems like a leap.
It does, but he sees Leibniz's fascination with the binary code, the zeros and ones, as a kind of philosophical precursor to this whole metaphysics of indeterminacy and the code.
So what defines this new operational configuration?
He lists things like cybernetic control, generation by models, as we just discussed, differential modulation, feedback loops, the question-answer structure of information systems.
Very computer science-y.
Exactly. Digitality. The idea that everything can be broken down into binary information becomes its metaphysical principle. And DNA, the genetic code, becomes its ultimate prophet or emblem.
Why DNA?
Because he sees the genetic code as the perfect, completed form of this genesis of simulacra. It's a code that generates life itself based on programmed information.
How does he describe the sign at this level?
At this level of the code, the old functions of signs, referring to reality, representing the imaginary, dealing with repression, those distinctions get effaced, they blur. We move towards the digital programmatic sign.
Which exists how?
It exists at the intersection of other signals. It has the structure of a micromolecular code of command and control. These aren't signs you read in the old way. They're more like operational signals, like programmatic matrices that determine outcomes.
Almost invisible instructions.
Right. Illegible in the traditional sense. Even our conception of space changes, becoming cellular, generated by these constantly firing signals.
He quotes Thomas Sebeek, the semiotician, right, about genetics and linguistics converging.
Yes. Sebeek highlighted how information is encoded and transmitted similarly in both language and genetics, calling the genetic code the most basic semiotic network. It reinforces this idea of a fundamental code underlying everything.
And he also mentions Jacques Monod's work, Chance and Necessity.
Right? And Monod's idea of the genetic code ruling life through discontinuous indeterminacy, but also having this built-in purpose, the teleonomic principle.
So Baudrillard argues that all those grand transcendent purposes or goals we used to believe in,
They get reduced to an instrument panel, basically, reduced to operational variables within the code. Though, interestingly, he notes we still often rely on the phantasm of nature as a kind of ultimate justification or reference point for the code itself.
and this ambition extends to society, trying to manage it like a code.
Absolutely. The techno-cybernetic dream is to govern the social order using an analogy to the genetic code. He mentions things like PPBS, planning, programming, budgeting system, as examples of this attempt.
So control shifts.
It shifts from control by pursuing a fixed end or goal to control by prediction, simulation, programmed anticipation, managing possibilities generated by the code itself.
Which brings us to the hyperrealism of simulation. He talks about digital space and the magnetic field of the code being different from the old police space. How so?
Well, the old police space was about direct coercion, commands, prohibitions, forceful signification. Don't do that.
Right.
The digital space of the code, he argues, works differently. It shifts from injunction to disjunction, from ultimatum to solicitation. It works by offering choices, modulating behavior through feedback, constant interaction, tactical engagement.
Less direct force, more
Yep.
shaping the environment.
Exactly. He talks about this emerging great culture of tactile communication within this sort of techno-lumino-kinetic space. Even environmentalism, the ecological imaginary, gets grafted onto this operational simulation.
Adapting to the simulated environment.
Precisely. He says electroshock is replaced by body attitude. Direct force yields to ambient apparatuses. Think about the design of spaces, user interfaces, nudges.
He mentions simulated environments like centers for cultural and aesthetic reanimation, and even sexual leisure centers.
Yeah, places designed to provide intense experiences through a totally controlled, simulated atmosphere, a kind of total environment.
He links this to Artaud's Theater of Cruelty, but calls it an abject black humor caricature. Why?
Because where Artaud sought genuine, raw cruelty and catharsis, these simulations replace cruelty with carefully managed stimulus thresholds and genuine catharsis with a kind of homeopathy by means of simulation, a safe, simulated release.
And this is where he defines hyperrealism.
Yes, hyperrealism, for Baudrillard, is the point where reality itself collapses into the meticulous reduplication of the real, its reality imploding into its own representation.
Because of endless reproduction across media.
Exactly. That constant reproduction makes the real original seem volatile, distant, almost unreal itself. It becomes a kind of fetishism of the lost object. We're obsessed with the signs of the real, precisely because the real itself is receding.
He sees earlier art movements like realism and surrealism as precursors.
Right. They played with the relationship between the real and its representation.
But hyperrealism goes further.
It faces the contradiction entirely. It gets rid of the tension between the real and the imaginary. In hyperreality, reality has passed completely into the game of reality. The simulation is the reality.
There's no outside anymore.
That's the idea. We even start to get a kind of consummate enjoyment from the signs of negative things, guilt, despair, violence, experienced safely within the simulation, replacing the actual feeling.
And systems perpetuate themselves. How?
Closed systems project themselves by constantly duplicating themselves, even incorporating critique as just another part of the simulation, duplicating itself as its own critique.
He uses that wild example of the satellization of the real, like literally sending a 2-room apartment into orbit.
Yeah, as a perfect materialization of this hyperreality, taking the most mundane reality and turning it into a pure simulation, an orbital model detached from any context.
And the example of the Tupolev pilots filming their own crash. That's chilling.
It is. He sees it as this ultimate short circuit, where the event is instantly consumed by its own representation. The response is swallowed by the question. The image preempts the reality.
So traditional symbolic things like mirrors or art, which reflected or represented reality.
They get replaced by this aesthetic fascination with the medium itself, special effects, editing, the technology of simulation. Reality is just constantly exposed to the glare of models.
And art itself, it saw this coming.
He argues art prefigured this turn by focusing on everyday life, the banal, and entering into infinite reproduction. Eventually, even the most mundane things become aestheticized.
And production, making things, follow suit.
Yes, production also enters this aesthetic reduplication. It loses its content, its purpose, its finality, and becomes abstract, self-referential, much like art took on the value of the finality without end.
Art and production swap places.
Kind of, yeah. Art becomes industrialized, production becomes aestheticized, which leads him to that punchline. So art is everywhere, since artifice lies at the heart of reality.
And therefore?
So art is dead, since not only is its critical transcendence dead, but reality itself has become inseparable from its own image.
Wow. Art is everywhere, and art is dead.
A classic Baudrillard paradox.
He finishes by describing this schizophrenic vertigo of serial signs that have no counterfeit, where the simulation principle dominates the reality principle as well as the pleasure principle. That's a pretty dizzying place to end up.
It is. He paints this picture of a world where reality's boundaries have just dissolved, where the very idea of an original is maybe becoming meaningless.
Okay, so to try and wrap this up, we've taken a really deep dive into Baudrillard's pretty challenging argument about this massive shift, right? Moving from a world focused on making physical things and their tangible value
To this realm of signs, codes, and simulations.
where the lines between what's real and what's artificial just get blurrier and blurrier.
Increasingly difficult to distinguish.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how things like social media, all this technology, consumer culture, how they feed into this hyperreal state.
Absolutely. How does it shape our perception?
Yeah. And what does it even mean for our understanding of truth anymore? Or value? Or, reality itself?
Those are the big questions his work forces us to ask, and maybe leaves you, the listener, to think about. If our reality is becoming more and more like a simulation, does that concept of an original, something authentic, even hold water anymore?
Doesn't matter.
And maybe even more crucially, what new forms of power, what new kinds of control might be emerging in this landscape of the hyperreal, this world where the map, the simulation, seems to be actively creating the territory?